When Steel talks, everybody listens.
Professor Lawrence Waldron is a true crony who is into this art form in a serious way. And when he talks Calypso, he isn't joking. He is really serious about this. He is doing something, again, that's why I said at the beginning that it looks like the gender thing is a big thing when we're talking about Sparrow. Because Professor Waldron, who is at City College teaching art history, he is talking about Jean and Joe. Jean and Joe. Gender relations in post-World War II Trinidad and Tobago. So, without further ado, I want to introduce Professor Lawrence Waldron.
Is it Colin that's the volunteer guy doing the...
Chris. No,
Chris, yeah. Chris, I don't think we need to play track one. That's
okay.
Gina and Dinah, everybody knows that. Everyone can sing it, right? But we'll do the second song, which is Don't Go Joe, which is why the title of my paper is Gina and Joe. I was reading this paper on the train and it's way too long. So what I've done is truncated the first 4 pages, but I'll give you a synopsis. It basically lays the plan out of World War II in Trinidad, and it gives a lot of details about that. Maybe I'll publish it at some point and you can read that intro that leads up to Sparrow's vainglorious entrance as a respondent to rum and Coca-Cola, because to me, Gina and Dinah is the other bookend of World War II. So it starts with the rum and Coca-Cola years, we could call them, and there are a lot of songs in that vein. And then Gina and Dinah comes along and responds to the end of the process of the American occupation of Trinidad and Tobago. So just some basic facts. 1941, the Brits and the Americans signed the Basis for Destroyers Agreement. So I'm just throwing these ideas out so I can keep it short. Or as the Americans call it, the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. I kid you not, they move around the name, right? Because it's a matter of perspective. The Americans enter the war. In 1941, they get all of those bases in all the British colonies throughout the Caribbean. They give the British 50 mothball ships that they weren't using anyway. This land is on a 99-year lease, so they will be present in these islands for 99 years is the deal. As soon as the Americans come, it changes the way Trinidadians look at the world and definitely at America, but I would like to propose as well that it changes how Americans see the world. I'll read you just this one paragraph. The Americans brought with them a kit of cultural boons, economic benefits, and social problems. And they brought these to an island colony that, like Felix the cat's bag, was larger on the inside than the outside. On their military maps, the colony seemed little more than a speck. But once arrived at Pointe-à-Pierre, Fort Reed, or Chagaramas, a soldier or sailor from Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, Oklahoma, might be shocked to find himself surrounded by Hindus with a double O. That's how they spelt it back then. Mohammedans and Roman Catholics of all stripes and pigmentations, some of whom knew more about New York than they did, sometimes from personal experience. But the Americans also expanded the view of the locals in myriad aspects of speech, terminologies, personal mannerisms, dress, and social customs. We started calling these pants instead of trousers and stuff like that. It began to transform our language. With the British running the place, but the Americans effectively having taken over the place, the esteem in which Trinidadians held the British began to slip, because here was a completely different kind of white people. These Americans, with a tendency towards candor and boisterousness and unexpected acts of generosity every now and then. And they're full of money. They want to build those bases, and money is like raining from the heavens compared to what it was like before. This is the tail end of the global depression. People remember that and the hard choices they had to make during that time. And now the Americans are building 225 bases on the island of Trinidad. Bases, military bases. 100,000 American soldiers and sailors show up in the country. That increases the population by a third. A third in 4 years. This is a transformative event. The way that people are going to react to this is going to be myriad. But these American men, they're expecting a little company. And they have a lot of downtime because most of the war they're having is with submarines. It's not happening on the island. They're working with the black men in the country, and at the end of the workday, they don't socialize with them because Americans might be generous, but their color line is even stricter than the British one. So there's no socialization with black males except if they come to your house on an anthropological slumming tour, right? Women don't work on a basis because they're not carpenters or tradesmen, but women can cross that color line in some ways that are beginning to disturb the men. And so, just like the mighty British Empire now has a new empire competing with it and undermining it in the colony of Trinidad, Yankees so much better, right? Right? So that's one perception, but also in the household, the man is king, right? He kind of learned that from the British, actually, right? The man is king of his home. But now, if a woman can get her hands on money independently, she doesn't have to answer to that man anymore. So the British are losing control, and the men of all colors are losing control. The British lose control over the colonized people, the men lose control over the women. There's a lot of options on the table now, and society will be rearranged. Right, so that's a synopsis of the first 3 pages, which would have taken 15 minutes. What I'd like to say that at the end of the rum and Coca-Cola years, Calypso itself will change. The Americans go back home, and they're going back home with a stack of Calypso records, by the way. The Calypso craze will begin in the United States. But fresh in everyone's mind are the many songs by Lord Invader, not just rum and Coca-Cola, but many songs by Lord Invader that are about how the Americans wrecked his life. But we all know the lyrics from Rum and Coca-Cola, and most poignant to me is a verse that says, "There are some aristos in Port of Spain. I know a lot, but I won't call name. And in the day they wouldn't give you a right, but you should see them with the foreigners in the night." I knew a couple who get married one afternoon and was to fly to Miami on their honeymoon. But the bride ran away with a sailor lad, and the stupid husband went staring mad. Right? That's from the war years. So, the war has ended now, 10 years later. We have a response to rum and Coca-Cola. A decade after the war, a young scion of Calypso's next great generation would begin his career by toasting the departure of the Americans and the collapse of that rum and Coca-Cola cottage industry that back in wartime had pulled women away from their coal pots, joking boards, and embroidered coverlets. It was now 1956, and a major scale back on the American presence at Chagaramas was happening. It was in the news. It was fresh in everybody's minds. 1956, they scaled back to a very large extent the remaining forces in Trinidad. They're there 10 years after, and they finally scale back. The young singer that I'm talking about, this young scion, was a fellow named Slinger Francisco that had been liming around and hustling tourists up on the lookout and down Gaza Strip, singing calypsos and other ditties for tips. That's from Louis Regis's book, who is the other expert on calypso, Regis, R-E-G-I-S. His sobriquet, this young scion's sobriquet, up until recently had been Little Sparrow, for the quick, excited movements he made on stage at the old brigade tent, even as his upperclassmen stood stationary like reciting poets as they sung. But in the past couple of years, he had steadily gained in popularity and was singing his own songs now, not the songbooks of the Calypso greats, which he had learned actually, so that might be in response to your question. And many of these greats had started looking at him with interest. Now he was insisting that people call him the mighty Sparrow. He wasn't just a quarrelsome little garden bird anymore. He had won the Calypso Monarch competition of 1956 and had knocked them for 6 in a road march with a song about the aftermath of the war and the recent scale back. The evolutionists hadn't yet developed the notion that birds might be descended from the mighty dinosaur, but Sparrow seemed to have figured that out and had taken his place at the top of the Calypso food chain. Above, a roaring lion and a growling tiger and a plethora of lords. Sparrow's road march anthem was Jean and Dinah. It had an unusual 16-bar chorus, but everyone thought it was fun to sing, including at the top of their lungs on Carnival Day. Even the children were singing it, clueless of the offense it was giving to their parents and the licks they were about to get. Rafiq Shah comments on that about his own childhood. Its lyrics were not for the shrinking violet. It was a song of masculine retribution upon the hostesses of World War II. But young Sparrow was not calling for jail time for the numberless violations of the colony's decency laws, nor for the return of these USO Jamets to their barrack yards and gingerbread houses. He was all for leaving them right where they were, Dong Marine Square and certain streets in the eastern part of the city which will remain nameless, loitering around the savannah just beyond the reach of hotel watchmen. Instead, the mighty Sparrow advocated taking advantage of the now depressed Jamet economy. Well, the girls in town feeling bad, no more Yankees in Trinidad. They're gonna close down the base for good. Them girls have to make out how they could. Brother, is now they pack up in town. In for a penny and in for a pound. Believe me, it's competition for so trouble in the tongue when the price drop low. Things bad is to hear them cry. Not a sailor in town, the nightclub's dry. Only West Indians like me or you come in to take a drink or two. And as we have things back in control, I seeking revenge with my heart and soul. Brother, when I spread the news around, it's to see all them caveman pack up in town. It's the glamour boys again. We are going to rule Port of Spain. No more Yankee to spoil the fete. Dorothy have to take what she get. All of them who used to make style, they taking 2 shilling with a smile. No more hotel to rest your head. Like the sweat of thy brow, thou shalt eat bread. No, Sparrows is not a clarion call to return to the old and always floridly imagined pre-war status quo, as post-war Americans themselves were doing back home by yanking women off the assembly lines and handing them back their old kitchen aprons. Instead, Sparrow was more interested in seeing those high-brown aristos from Lord Invader's song work even harder for a fraction of the former compensation. Gene and Dinah is a lesson in pre-depression, but also neoliberal capitalism. Competition breeds not only lower prices for the consumer, but also more desperate workers who know that in an unregulated economy, where they have no right to collective bargaining, they are expendable. But young Sparrow hadn't met Milton Friedman and hadn't shown up in Port of Spain fresh from Grenada with a collection of Ayn Rand novels under his arm. He was only 1 when he came. He was only 1, so Trini or Grenadian. And he certainly was not driven by some cool, heartless ideology to snipe cheap sex from the now abandoned and desperate prostitute class of Port of Spain. No, his motivation was hotter than that. By the second verse, it is clear that Slinger has a score to settle. Vengeance is his motivation. And by the third verse, when he calls in his posse, the Glamour Boys, a loosely affiliated crew of post-war saga boys, and then the general male public on top of that, we realize that the departure of the occupying Americans has actually left a civil war in its wake, a bona fide battle of the sexes. The reference to the general male public as cavemen is a telling detail that supports his epic interpretation of the gender conflict that Sparrow describes. The popular term is used by Attila in his 1937 duet with Roaring Lion, a song called I Will String Along With You. In that cynical calypso, where they both riff on the 1934 Dick Powell song from the film 20,000 Sweethearts, the two calypsonians argue over the proper attitude towards female partners. Roaring Lion thinks he should be the boss of the show, whereas Attila, who is otherwise infamous for his distrust of women in songs like Women Will Rule the World, a classic, he admonishes Lion from the female perspective. So he takes on the feminine role in that song. And he says, Lion, you're as stupid as you can be. You know nothing of woman's psychology. You say you are loving, but you are rough. You can't get away with that caveman stuff. Thus, at least in 1937, the reference in song to the caveman had echoed common parlance in which the caveman denoted a dominating, even brutish male in his interactions with women. By inviting the cavemen to town to take advantage of Jean, Dinah, Rosita, Clementina, and the rest, the young glamour boy Sparrow is tossing his leavings to an even more vengeful, more brutal squad of his native male insurgency. Like the numberless African, Latin American, and Southeast Asian dictators of the post-war and post-colonial era, young Sparrow is not just interested in banishing the occupiers, but in taking their place. He evinces a real sense of vainglory in his proposed takeover as he suddenly switches from the natural use of contractions and local idioms throughout the whole song to clearly enunciate and in a somewhat despotic voice, we are going to rule Port of Spain. No contractions, not we're going to rule Port of Spain. It's a very declarative Mussolini-esque kind of. The following verse in the song introduces another often forgotten would-be female victim, perhaps neglected because she is a calypso leitmotif of the time. Going by the chorus, it is actually easy to forget that 5 women, not 4, are named in the song, and Dorothy is the 5th. When Sparrow gleefully notes that there will be no more Yankees to spoil the fete, it is so he can say, Dorothy, you have to take what she get. The use of the generic Dorothy to denote an unmanageable woman or one of questionable morals was Calypso code since well before the war. In the Calypso recordings from 1936 to 1946, literally dozens of such compositions can be counted from Radio and Growler and all those guys, far outnumbering all other female names, Caroline, Matilda, Millicent, right? So it was certainly not anyone's decision to make Dorothy the scarlet name, as it were, but rather the result of a kind of organic consensus that had settled into place as the Calypsos responded to each other in the market tent of musical ideas. Right, so it's a consensus thing. Future generations of Calypsonians, at least those with long memories and a reverence for tradition, would revisit the name, like Black Stalin's Wajang girlfriend Dorothy, who must wait impatiently for Stalin to finish jamming Shidong, because first he must fire another salvo against the injustices in the land. Wait, Dorothy, wait. Right? But Dorothy wants the wine, right? But wait. Right? Of course, not every Dorothy in Calypso is trouble. Even Sparrow used the name on several different occasions in more positive lights. His I think it's from 58, is a sincere love song. His 1958 recording Dorothy, I think it might be 59, but it's called Dorothy, and it was mentioned earlier, is a sincere love song to a somewhat demure and quote-unquote divine Dorothy. But in the spirit of the war years, his 1956 debut song resurrects the ignoble old Dorothy from the 30s and early 40s and warns her that she will sweat for her pay. Poor Dorothy, along with Jean and the rest of them, is the sacrificial cock on the altar of Sparrow's career. It's the sacrifice of Dorothy's sweat that activates Sparrow's seppi. It goes without saying that Calypso has been a male-dominated pursuit from the beginning, even though every generation has had a few celebrated female Caisonians, from before Lady Irie, up past Singing Sandra, and now with the numbers growing. But the form itself has some infrastructural type things that cause a male voice to emerge over all others. There's an overarching structure to it. Keith Warner and Gordon Roller have written at length about the male-female interplay in Calypso, and I suppose one of the reasons I was invited to speak at this symposium is because I wrote a whole novel exploring the gender and gendered anxieties between people and nations, because nations have a gender when one invades the other. Right? So nations, there's a gender dynamic between nations as well. At the risk of sounding like I'm quoting myself, I'll say this about Calypso in general. In the mid-20th century, Calypso was at an apogee as a uniquely modern medium, one characterized by stylized dialogue, terse, unflinching commentary on current events, dry wit, double entendre, and an intense gender anxiety. Like a work of pulp fiction, Sparrow's Jean and Dinah lays male anxieties bare about the financially liberated, if only temporarily liberated, female who disregards hypernormative social restrictions in a professor talk on her sexuality and proposes a kind of savage corrective in the name of the public, or the glamour boys, I guess. Before it won Road March and all of those accolades, including winning him the king's position, Gene and Dinah was also a personal triumph for Sparrow because he pitched it to Salvatore as a commercial, as a jingle for them. And they said basically, kid, don't call us, we'll call you, and they never called. The original lyrics were Gene and Dinah, Rosita and Clementina, come to me one morning after they complete their shopping. And they told me, honey, I never had more luxury, more than when I stopped and went into Salvatore to shop. Wow. That was the original song. Right? And they never called him. And then the Yankees scaled back the bass. So it was like kismet. They scaled back the bass. And so he changed the lyrics to this post-war, very angsty kind of song. The new lyrics reflected current events in the news. The bases were being scaled back, and they will continue to be scaled back because of the agitation of Dr. Williams and basically the general public. So the 99-year lease would eventually give way. And guess what's going to happen when the 99-year lease is rescinded by the newly independent Republic of Trinidad and Tobago in 1963? Another song comes out by Sparrow. Don't Go Joe. Yep. That's when he composes Don't Go Joe, and it comes out the following year as a recording. So Don't Go Joe comes out after the Yankees finally go. And the lyrics in Don't Go Joe take a completely different attitude towards the female protagonist / antagonist. How about we play it? We get to hear Don't Go Joe, which is less familiar to a lot of people. That's track 4. So, louder.
The Yankees came and went, and broke the heart of my kid sister, Mary said. The Yankee man came and went, he broke the heart of my kid sister, Mary said. I made no need to watch him spoke out, not knowing she was so much in love. When he said she goodbye, she kneeled down and started crying. Now don't go, Joe, don't go. You wouldn't know, Joe, I love you so. And when you're gone, I never without you. So Joe, please, Joe, don't go.
If we can fast forward just a little bit. Just fast forward a little bit, if that's possible. All right. Okay, that's a good place. Thanks.
You wouldn't know, but I love you so. And when you're gone, I can't go on without you. So Joe, please don't go.
Whoopsie mama.
Yeah. You know Yankee love the sport. Every soldier got a girl in a different part. And when you imagine a white surprise, you see Tennessee soldiers. So they don't say that's not right. So I know the girl getting mama guy. Instead of looking for gas, so stupid, she tells the Yankee horse, don't go, Joe, don't go. You wouldn't know.
This song has a twist in the ending.
And when you're gone, Jody got a shape for she on the street. Like love talk is all she knows. She ain't talk like that. He ain't talk about dough.
I actually had to correct some old transcriptions I had found someplace else. And the first verse, I won't go through the whole song, but the first verse has a part where it's a little garbled. The Yankees came and went and broke the heart of my kid sister Millicent. Right, so that's a line that's a little hard to hear there. I think you got the whole part about, you know, Yankee love their sport. Every soldier got a girl in a different port. You could imagine how I surprised to see tears in the soldier eyes, right? And he's not sure who's getting mama guy here, right? But in this last verse, Millicent is his sister, and he feels really bad for her. The girl have nothing to eat. She belly big. At a shame for she on the street. Like love talk is all she knows. She ain't talk. Neither he ain't talking about dough. But when he gone is when Millie show me a big fat wallet with plenty money. She say he brain him bigger than mine. I was crying, but a picky pocket same time. But I want to point something out anthropologically in this song. Note the naturalized Americanisms throughout the song, from Sparrow's reference to his younger sister as his kid sister, his exclamations of whoopsie mama after choruses, and the characterization of money as dough. Much has been noted, including in Calypso itself, about the American idioms, slangs, and terms that seeped into Trinbagonian parlance during and immediately following the war years. Even as foreign servicemen went home whistling calypsos and calling girls mopsies in the Trinidad way. So there was an exchange. It wasn't just influence, it was exchange. Most famously, Sir Lancelot himself, a Hollywood extra and nightclub singer, made a study of the American effect on his homeland, which he only knew from visits by then, commenting in his song Trinidad is Changing that every young Creole shootin' jive, and that if you ask a Trinidad mopsy to do a little waltzing, she would say, buddy, get hep, you gotta swing. Suffice it to say that in the song Millicent is in a bad way, right? She's obviously pregnant and broke, as they say, in a bad way. And the sailor has to leave, back to his life and his wife, which is mentioned in the song, his wife back in America. But as it turns out, the sailor actually has feelings for sweet Millie, despite his marriage to another. All things, trysts, infidelities being equal, the desperate Millicent decides to recuperate some of her losses. She robs him. Of course, this can hardly pay for the upbringing of a child, no matter how much greenbacks are in that wallet. But Millicent's maneuver leaves us wondering where she picked up those thieving skills, how long she has been using them, how often, and on whom. It's a war thing. How much money might Millicent have in her biscuit tin? Again, it can't be enough to mind a child up to age 18 or 21. Just like Gene and Dinah, 1964's Don't Go Joe marked an important event at Chaguaramas, right? So I've mentioned what that event is, so I'm just going to move on and try to hem up. Indeed, Calypsonians are known for switching, like we see between Gene and Dinah and Don't Go Joe. They are known for having multiple perspectives on things, for sometimes changing their perspective from one part of their career to another. Chalk Dust does it with We Is We, which is an anthem to Creolite, or Mélange or Mestizaje, or whatever you want to call the fact that we are mixed, right? But most of his songs after that are Afrocentric songs, and They Ain't See Africa at All reads like almost like a critique of the kind of Creolite that usually floats to the top. We are mixed, especially with the European. right? It's a very common feature of Latin American Creolite. They celebrate one part of their mix more than the other, and it kind of seeps into the Caribbean as well. So indeed, Calypsonians are known for adopting different and even opposing views, not only across the years of their careers, but sometimes on opposite sides of the same record. A side, B side has two completely different songs. This does not result from some personal defect or duplicity. It is not the result of the multiple composers that people use, especially Sparrow. In fact, that's a Sparrow composition, Don't Go Joe, as far as I've been able to prove. Sparrow being a famous example, right? Rather, the apparent split personality of Calypso is a historical feature of the Caisonian's craft and the artist's function in society. Calypsonian is griot, is troubadour, presenting the events of the day with a license to editorialize. The issues change and can be seen from multiple angles, especially when consulting the audience in call and response in the tent. We have an audience telling Sparrow, "You lie!" at the end of Congo Man. That's a common occurrence. This multivalent perspective of the consensus-forged Calypsonian is why a typically misogynistic Attila the Hun can turn around and not only play a female character in a spoken prologue to I Will String Along With You, but also present the female viewpoint throughout the song. If you know anything about Attila, he used to dress like a woman on stage and do like a little drag thing at the USO and the Calypso tent. And throughout the song, he chastises Lion for his caveman ways. It is also why lots of Calypsonians throughout their career have espoused completely opposing views. So we shouldn't be surprised that Sparrow would switch polarities to approach Millicent in Don't Go Joe with a completely diametric emotion to that which he does for Jean, Dorothy, and Dinah. And if Jean, Dorothy, and Dinah deserve to be exploited by agents at home because they had set themselves up for exploitation by agents from abroad, but Millicent deserves our sympathy, and she ought to do what she can to balance the scales, even if she has to rob the guy, then it would seem that Calypso presents us not with the discrete abstractions of an issue, but the paradoxes of a narrative. This is not unnatural because Calypso has always operated more like a national discourse, stitched through with impulses, insights, and the wit of a people. It is not a single operatic masterpiece. It doesn't go for singularity. In its first 200 years, it has concerned itself not so much with grandeur as with balancing the poetic and the prosaic. And few have approached this precarious trapeze more ably than the mighty Sparrow, like a bird balancing on a buzzing high-tension wire before flitting off to another topic. And that's it for me.
Thank you.
Last, I really wanted to sing Sasaye. Sasaye is one of those typical masculinist bragalypso. Let's call it that, right? Sasaye, bonje, monsieur, ukachue moi. What is that? Are you trying to kill me? Right? Right? Leve, ou vote la porte la garçon, moka ale. Right? So open the door, let me get out of here. Right? You're trying to kill me with that thing. That's typical, that other side of Sparrow, but then we have that sensitive Sparrow we've been talking about. I stuck that in because that's really what I wanted to do my paper about, but I thought this was more responsible scholarship. Thank you.
If you have any other questions, if you have a question of Lawrence Waldron or anyone else,
Call me a true Trini because I don't sound like one.
Is he okay?
who?
Sparrow?
Yeah.
Is he okay?
Yeah, he's a little diminished, but he's
Every summer in front of the house, he used to sing for Maggie Markowitz every summer in front of
the last event we had like this, he was still going strong. He was kind of into his faith. That gospel album had come out. And then he shocked some people by some other stuff he sang after the gospel songs at church. It's what we heard from Frankie McIntosh. Same old Sparrow. And now the Queen has given him an award, even though he sang Philip My Dear.
I would like to know from all of the speakers, where do you put Calypso Rose?
Oh.
With respect to Sparrow.
She's a contemporary. She's madly adored by all of her contemporaries. I've never heard anybody say a bad word about her. And I jumped from Lady Irie to singing Sandra, but in my text it actually stops and deals with Rose and Francine, right? Because that's who I grew up with, and there was more than one Lady Calypsonian, right? So that normalized it for me that lots of women sing Calypso, even though when I stopped to count, it was only 2. But Rose is highly esteemed, and probably less. We should have one of these about Rose.
Yeah, she deserves that kind of attention. Anybody else with a question? But if there, okay, looking at you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Hi. Thank you all very much. I must say, as you know, every panelist I think touched on it. The woman loves Sparrow, and Sparrow loved the woman. What I would have liked to see, even though you guys ably looked into all the themes of women and Sparrow, I would have loved to hear the woman's voice up there, giving their perspective on Sparrow and the theme. So, you know, that's the only thing that was missing.
Excuse me. I don't want it to look like we're sexist or anything like that. But there was a lady, a colleague of Ray Allen actually at Brooklyn College, who was at one of our forums before, who was very interested in being here, but the date clashed with the conference she had to do in Atlanta, and that's why she was here.
Conference busy right now.
But you know, the woman's voice is not something that we stayed away from. We would have loved to have one. I'm sorry.
Leave it on the side.
Question in the back.
I want to know something, okay? Calypso was before reggae, of Jamaican music etc. And then all of a sudden that came up through Cliff and Marley, and that took over the whole West Indian culture in terms of music. Where did we go wrong? Where did Calypso go wrong?
I know some people, you're hearing like people uncomfortable with the question, but I like that question. That question comes up all the time, and I like that question.
Can you repeat that? Is the topic for
His question is, reggae took over, what happened to Calypso? First of all, I would like the other people to respond after I respond, because I'm going to have a very specific response. I don't think something went wrong. I think there was a Calypso craze, and the way Calypso was marketed and packaged here was as his happy escapist music. When the Andrews sisters stole rum and Coca-Cola, they whitewashed the lyrics and made it all about going on vacation, right? And that is pretty much the image of the whole Caribbean, but Jamaica has managed to shake that off with a very interesting alchemy of American elements in reggae, because Jamaica gets American radio from just a few miles away. And I will point out that the islands of the Greater Antilles, they are more famous here, but they also pay a really big price for it. America keeps its eye on the Greater Antilles a lot more and has historically done so than the Lesser Antilles, except Trinidad during the war. Trinidad was the largest oil refinery in the British economy, in the British Empire, and so it was a jewel. But the Greater Antilles, American foreign policy has been acted upon the Greater Antilles all the time. So the Greater Antilles is always on America's mind. And that cultural exchange between the Greater Antilles, including Jamaica, obviously, lent itself to a more sincere investigation of reggae and what reggae does. And reggae is rebel music. It starts out as a plaintive rebel music, and that in many ways fits into the American discourse on like folk music and certain kinds of rebellious forms of African American music. So reggae has enjoyed a very successful career here in the United States as a counterculture music, whereas Calypso was never perceived as such. We know what's going on in the Calypso lyrics, but Americans hear Belafonte, and it's a happy music, and here come the boats, they came in this morning, and come and count my bananas. Right? He wants to respond.
Isn't that in part the fault of the Caribbeans?
But you keep seeing it as a bad thing. Do Trinidadians want necessarily to have the same market as reggae? Because I would say we don't, and many of us would like that, but others, I think the new guys, they're in the music game to get paid, they would like that.
Yeah.
But we would lose something.
That's right.
Right, to be so closely surveilled by the American market and have them come and regulate our Calypso for us.
Well, I think
Right?
Trinidad Tobago Calypso music throughout the Caribbean. And what happens after Carnival Monday and Tuesday? Ash Wednesday. No Calypso is played after.
Right. Not in Trinidad.
I love that.
Not in Trinidad.
That's long time.
That's what
You guys,
That's what's happening today. Ash Wednesday is done and over with, and that still carries on.
okay, I get your point, and let's say it's like 1990 where that is still absolutely true, because you hear people saying it's not exactly like that anymore. Even under those circumstances, what shames Trinidadians more than that is that Antigua doesn't stop playing Kaiso after Ash Wednesday. The small islands jamming Calypso all year round.
All year round.
That little time to make that music.
Right.
Reggae music can be played year-round, Christmas, summer,
And again, its content makes it always very relevant. But I saw comments over here.
Ladies and gentlemen, excuse me. This should have come up when we first started, because I know this is a subject that a lot of people would like to sound off on. Unfortunately, we have to wrap it up.
Unless you gotta do it again.
Well, we don't want it. Absolutely. We have to wrap it up. I want to thank all of you for the interest you've shown in this. Please take a look outside the CDs, and if you're interested in making a